Our second presenter is Mr. Harfouch. He is a faculty member at the American University of Beirut. His research includes Islamic political theology, liberation theology, and Islamic studies. His recent publications pertain to Hegel, Fanon, and the problem of recognition. The title of his presentation is Justice, Islam, and the Inclusion of the Other. Again, the stage is yours.
Just to clarify, it's a former faculty member, currently in Saudi. Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So the topic that I am going to be addressing is the concept of justice in Islam and the concept of oppression. Now, to do so, I can't talk about the concept of oppression in Islam or in the Quran without first situating it within the Qur'anic concept of al-mizan. Al-mizan translates into the word balance. So the Quran states, quote, "He has raised up the sky, he has set the balance, the mizan, so that you may not exceed the balance. Weigh with justice and do not fall short of the balance." So there's this idea in the Quran that the cosmos is in a state of equilibrium, that the cosmos is in a state of balance. So understanding this idea of the mizan, understanding the idea of the balance is critical for then going on to understand the concept of justice or to understand the concept of oppression. Now, the way in which the word mizan in the Quran is used, it's used in two ways. It's used to refer to a permanent cosmos, a permanent balance, but it's also used to describe a ontological vocation or a prescriptive imperative. So the Quran, so for example, Toshihoko Aizutsu, in talking about this idea of the mizan, he says, I quote, "The human side of the phenomena being basically a response to the initiative displayed by God." So you have this balance, the cosmos, and then you have the human imperative of preserving that balance. So the word order here, the word order in the Quran, the mizan, it refers both to a cosmic balance and it refers to a prescriptive imperative wherein man is required to preserve that balance. Now, the Quran also warns that this cosmic order, that this mizan, this balance, is vulnerable to transgression. It's vulnerable to be falling into a state of disequilibrium. So the Quran says, quote, "So that you may not exceed the balance," and then it repeats this warning saying, "Weigh with justice and do not fall short of this balance." Now, transgressing against the balance is in the Quran what we refer to as zulm or oppression. And as Toshihoko Aizutsu points out, the word oppression, zulm, in the Quran is found in almost every page of the Quran. He says, I quote, in defining zulm, "It is to act in such a way as to transgress the proper limit and encroach upon the rights of some other person. To do injustice in the sense of going beyond one's own bounds and doing what one has no right to." So zulm or oppression in the Quran refers to transgression. When you transgress against the mizan, when you transgress against the balance, against a divinely ordained balance. So this brings us to the definition of justice in Islam. Justice in Islam is a state of being wherein things are in their proper place, wherein things are in a state of equilibrium. Now, the core notion that underpins and that defines the concept of justice in Islam, al-adala, is the proper place of God in relation to the world, in relation to man. So we find throughout the Quran that there is an ontological differentiation between the creator absolute and the created relative, between God and non-God, between God and the cosmos. So the only hierarchy of reality, or the only hierarchy of being that is legitimated in the Quran, is the man-God hierarchy. And as such, there can be no absolute hierarchies between man or between man and the cosmos. Now, to understand what exactly is the origins of oppression in the Quran, the origins of zulm, we have to go back to this Quranic concept of al-nafs al-ammara. Al-nafs al-ammara translates into the commanding self. This refers to the non-reflective, acritical I, right? In much the same way we have the Cartesian ego cogito, we have in the Quran this idea of the I. So the imbalance that occurs in the nafs al-ammara, the commanding self, is at the level of consciousness, wherein the intellect has an image of the world that's in a state of disequilibrium. And this I is a totalizing I, in the sense that it centers upon itself rather than having God as the center. So this totalizing I, this totalizing self, is a self that is it is a unrefined ego. The flesh in this sense becomes an idol. It becomes the kingdom of this world. And according to Dussel, it promulgates its own laws, its own morality, and its own goodness. So in the words of Wa al-Halaq, it refers, the nafs al-ammara refers to a state wherein the ultimate frame of reference is the ontological reality of the ego. And as such, the I, the nafs, is disposed to put to service and subjugate that which surrounds it. So, in the words of Taha Abdul Rahman, what the nafs engages in is self-attribution, which leads to self-divination, right? The I becomes a godlike figure and transgresses against the balance by virtue of having centered upon itself rather than recognizing the centrality or the centeredness of God. Now, what are the origins of the nafs al-ammara? So in the Quran, we have this idea of al-ghafla. Ghafla literally means the absence of a thing from the mind. It refers to forgetfulness or it refers to intentional neglect. Now, ghafla is used in the Quran in the sense of the neglect of God or the absence of God consciousness in mediating the relationship between the self and the cosmos. And the word ghafla correlates directly to the word man in Islam. The word man in the Arabic language is al-insan. And the word insan comes from the word nisyan. And nisyan means to be forgetful. So al-ghafla is a state wherein forgetfulness becomes a ruling principle and a state of being. So again, we have the mizan, which is divinely ordained balance. We have zulm, oppression, which refers to a transgression against that balance. And then we have the nafs al-ammara, which is the totalizing I, which is the unrefined ego that subjugates the world around it and that centers upon itself rather than recognizing the center that is God. Now, through ghafla, through the state of forgetfulness, the self surrenders its individual and its collective awareness. And the Quran describes this state, this totalization of the nafs as being zulm, as being oppressive in two senses. One, it is oppressive against oneself, and two, it is oppression against the other. Now, to approximate or to understand the crux of the problem here, the crux of the nafs al-ammara, we can draw on Enrique Dussel. So Enrique Dussel makes a striking observation about the origin and the nature of oppression. He says, I quote, that the totalizing system, be it the unrefined ego, which is the nafs, or be it an oppressive state or whatnot, tends to totalize itself, to center on itself, and to attempt to temporarily eternalize its present structure. And I'll unpack what that means. Then he says, spatially, it attempts to include within itself all possible exteriority. Now, this is key. This is key. To understand oppression, we have to understand this concept of exteriority. So exteriority refers to the state of being outside or external. So any totalizing system that wants to appear as though absolute, whether it's the I or an oppressive state, must negate any source of exteriority. It must negate anything which is outside of itself, which is external to itself. So the totalizing I, the nafs, in its attempt to sublimate itself, in its attempt to make itself appear as absolute, it must negate exteriority. So what are the sources of exteriority? Well, you have the exteriority of man, the exteriority of the other, the alterity of the other, and you have the absolute exteriority of God. Why is the other always exterior? Why does the other fall within the category of exteriority? For the simple fact that you cannot subjugate the other in the same way you subjugate a tool in a machine. The other has consciousness. The other has dispositions. The other has the capacity to reflect on oneself within a particular system. So be it the unrefined ego, the nafs, or the oppressive state, it will always attempt to negate exteriority. It will always try to absorb exteriority. And one of the ways in which it does so is by fabricating images about man, God, and the cosmos. So it spatially includes within its orbit all sources of exteriority by fabricating images of man, God, and the cosmos. Now, in the Quran, this idea of transgression, zulm, is linked directly to the encroachment upon the rights of others, right? So the idea of the zulm as a transgression against a divinely ordained balance falls within the context of a transgression against the other, a transgression of the self against the other. Why? Because the other is put into an improper place by displacing the other from the cosmos and absorbing it within the naive or hegemonic totality that is the self or the oppressive state. And here we have the Qur'anic concept of at-takabur. So takabur literally means the act of sublimation or to enlarge oneself. In the context of the Qur'an, it is the sublimation of a created being over another created being. It is to project oneself onto reality, right? And then subsequently to project one's own images onto reality. So essentially what happens is that reality, the world, man, God, and the cosmos are recreated in the image of the I, of the totalizing I, of the oppressive state, and so forth. So the Quran illustrates the condition of at-takabur, the state of takabbur, the archetypal example of Iblīs, Satan. So Satan was told to prostrate to Adam, and then Satan responds, I am better than him. You created me from fire and you created him from clay. So this was the first archetypal example of at-takabur, to sublimate oneself. So Enrique Dussel says, I quote, in negating the other, in negating God, sinners are left to themselves. They totalize themselves, asserting themselves as gods, fetishizing and divinizing themselves. They fall into idolatry. So the self, the totalizing I, or the oppressive state, falls into a state wherein it begins to create its own laws, its own morality, and its own goodness. Now, another correlated concept similar to takabbur in the Quran is the idea of tughyan. So tughyan literally means to transgress. And the one who transgresses in the Quran is referred to as al-taghut. So Toshihoko Aisuzu describes the taghut as a being which has I quote, which has lost the sense of creaturelessness, meaning it has forgotten its createdness. So this idea of oppression in Islam, or this idea of the taghut, or the idea of sublimation, essentially amounts to the creation of what Sherman B. Jackson calls second creators. And they are second creators precisely because they have recreated the other in their own image. They have recreated God in their own image, and they have projected themselves onto reality. So they have an impoverished view of reality. So the second creators alienate the other and alienate man from the first creator and from the primordial God-given self. So the tughyan and takabur lead to a state of alienation of the other and an alienation from the world. Now, this disfigurement of reality is literally the core of oppression, because oppression comes from the root word press, and presses are used to mold things, to flatten or reduce them in bulk. So when the second creators, the totalizing I, the unrefined ego, recreates man in its own image, it is essentially pressing man. It is remolding man in its own image according to its own impoverished view of reality. So this is par excellence the definition of reality, the definition of oppression in the Quran. Now, the other that is absorbed and the other that is appropriated by the unrefined ego, by the totalizing self, becomes an instrument in the environment that is created by the totalizing I, by the totalizing other. So to summarize, we have in the Quran, again, this key concept of al-mizan, which is the balance. And the core of this balance, the core of this this divinely ordained cosmos is the hierarchy. Okay, is the hierarchy between man and God. That there's only one absolute hierarchy, and that is the hierarchy between the created absolute and the created relative. So oppression or zulm refers to any state wherein hierarchies are set up between man, and this is oppressive because the only legitimate hierarchy and the only strata of being is that of the creator absolute and the created being. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.